Americans are, by almost any measure, the best in the world at air combat. 50 years, and no American pilot has been lost to an enemy aircraft in a fight the United States expected to win. The obvious explanation is money and machines, the best jets, the biggest budget, technology nobody can match. And that explanation is wrong. American pilots dominate the air, and that it cost almost nothing to build. Because there was a war where America had the better jet, the bigger budget, every technological edge, and still nearly lost the sky. Go back to Vietnam. Over Korea a decade earlier, American fighters had run up an air-to-air kill ratio often cited at around 10 to 1. 10 enemy aircraft down for every one lost. By Vietnam, that number had collapsed to roughly 2 to 1. And during the linebacker campaigns of June and July 1972, for stretches it dropped below 1 to 1, and American pilots were losing as often as they were winning. That collapse is partly real and partly an illusion, and the difference matters. The Korea figure counted mostly F-86 Sabres flying offensive combat patrols. The Vietnam figure counted nearly every air-to-air loss, reconnaissance planes, lumbering A-1 Sky Raiders, even HH-53 rescue helicopters pulled out of the sky. Correct for that, and the two ratios sit much closer together than the raw numbers suggest. So the shock of Vietnam was, in part, a shock of perception. But perception drives reform, and what it pointed at was real. Across the whole war, American air-to-air combat produced 269 aircraft shot down. The United States lost 1,737 fixed-wing aircraft to hostile action between February 1962 and October 1973. Something in the way America fought in the air was not working the way the brochures promised. If this is the kind of history you want done properly, a quick like genuinely helps the channel keep making it. Start with the airplane everyone remembers. The F-4 Phantom was a superb machine built for the wrong fight. It was designed as a Cold War interceptor. Its job was to kill Soviet bombers at long range with missiles, out past visual range, before they ever got close. It didn't even carry an internal gun. Nobody thought it would need one because doctrine at the time assumed turning dogfights were essentially impossible at supersonic speed. So pilots got little air combat maneuvering training. Then they reached Vietnam, where the fights bled down to subsonic speeds and turned into exactly the knife fights the doctrine said couldn't happen. And the missiles, the whole reason the gun was left off, did not deliver. The AIM-7 Sparrow, the long-range weapon the Phantom was built around, had a probability of kill under 10% in Vietnam. 612 Sparrows fired, 56 kills. That is about 9%. Only 2 of those kills came beyond visual range, the exact scenario the weapon existed for. The Navy's own review, the Ault Report, logged the numbers plainly. About 9% for the AIM-7, about 9% for the AIM-4, 18% for the heat-seeking AIM-9 during Rolling Thunder. One Phantom pilot, identified in the record only as Cheshire, put it in words no engineer could improve on. He called the missing gun the biggest mistake on the F-4 and said bullets are cheap and tend to go where you aim them. He wanted a gun. He wished he had had one. That report, the Ault Report, is the hinge this whole story turns on. In 1968, Captain Frank Ault was ordered by the Chief of Naval Operations to find out why American missiles were failing. The document he produced ran 480 pages and roughly 250 recommendations, and its central finding was the uncomfortable one. Many of those missiles weren't failing because the hardware was junk. They were being fired outside their launch envelope, too close, too far, too hard a turn. That isn't a manufacturing problem, that's a training problem. The pilots hadn't been taught the weapon. So Ault's central recommendation wasn't a better missile, it was a school. Build an advanced fighter weapons school, staff it with expert instructors, give it an instrumented range so every mock fight could be torn apart in the debrief afterward. Sit with how counterintuitive that was. The most technologically confident military on Earth had just discovered that its problem wasn't the airplane. It was the person in the cockpit, And the fix wasn't to buy something. It was to teach somebody. Invest in the pilot, not just the platform. The Navy moved first. In 1969, months after the Ault Report landed, it stood up the Navy Fighter Weapons School at Miramar, Top Gun. The idea was to recreate a realistic dogfight on purpose. Instructors flying dissimilar aircraft, small and nimble, to mimic the MiGs American pilots would actually face. Not another phantom pretending, a stand-in for the real enemy. And the results showed up in the numbers. By the end of the war, the Navy's kill ratio had climbed sharply, with some figures putting it as high as 12 or 13 to 1, and Top Gun graduates accounting for most of the Navy's MiG kills. That 12 to 1 figure is Navy only, though. Fold in the Marine Corps, and the fighter ratio comes down to around 9 to 1. Still a dramatic climb, just not a perfect one. Meanwhile, the Air Force watched its own ratio stay stuck near 2 to 1, barely moved since 1968. So in 1975 it built its own answer, Red Flag, first flown that November at Nellis Air Force Base. The founding logic came from a study called Red Baron, which found something stark: a pilot's odds of survival jumped dramatically once he had flown his first 10 combat missions. The problem was that too many pilots died during those 10. So Red Flag recreated those first 10 missions in a place where a mistake cost a grade, not a life. The first exercise ran 37 aircraft and 561 people, flying 552 sorties. Today it runs hundreds of aircraft and around 20,000 sorties a year. Now, why did this approach work so well for the Americans in particular? Because it fit how the enemy did not fight. Soviet and North Vietnamese doctrine leaned heavily on ground-controlled intercept, a controller on the ground guiding the pilot second by second, the pilot a guided executor with limited freedom to improvise. The American tendency ran the other way, leaning on the initiative and the individual pilot in the cockpit. The Americans use ground control too, though. A U.S. Air Force system called T-ball has been judged as critical to Air Force success in the linebacker campaigns as Top Gun was to the Navy's. So the American victory was never just grit and initiative. It was training plus technology, and anyone who tells you it was one and not the other is leaving out half the story. Still, the training took root in American soil for a reason, and that reason is cultural. There's a doctrine the U.S. military calls mission command. Push the decision down to the lowest level, trust the person on the spot to act inside the commander's intent without waiting to be told. Its roots are actually borrowed, and it descends in part from Prussian off-tracks tactic, adopted partly to offset the numerical disadvantage America faced against the Soviets in the Cold War. But one analysis from the Small Wars Journal makes the larger claim that mission command reflects how the United States military has always operated, reflective of the independent spirit and initiative upon which the nation was conceived and founded. That's an interpretation, not a fact. But it comes anchored to real moments. Gettysburg, where a general named Warren saw Little Round Top undefended and acted on his own authority to hold it. Desert Storm, where a young captain named H.R. McMaster pushed past his stop line at 73 Easting because the moment demanded it. A pattern of individuals deciding without permission at the exact moment it mattered. Which brings us to the scoreboard and to the honest limits of it. In Desert Storm in 1991, American fighters shot down 41 Iraqi aircraft, the last large air battle the United States has fought. The F-15 Eagle is often cited at 104 to 0, not one F-15 lost to an enemy aircraft. That figure is contested, though. Some accounts point to unacknowledged air-to-air losses, including the F-A-18 of Scott Spiker on the first night, likely downed by a MiG-25 and first blamed on a surface missile. And air-to-air combat has become vanishingly rare since 1991. Kosovo in 1999 produced 5 kills, so the scoreboard reflects a shortage of opponents as much as it reflects superiority. What it shows cleanly is different. In Desert Storm, the Air Force lost 14 aircraft across more than 29,000 sorties, under 0.05% against 16,000 surface-to-air missiles and 750 enemy combat aircraft. That number is real, and it's staggering. So why are Americans so good at air combat? Not because of the machine. The machine failed first, over Vietnam, and forced a harder answer. America got good the day it stopped trying to buy its way to air superiority and started teaching its way there, building schools that trained the pilot as ruthlessly as the enemy would. The training was the spark, but the spark caught because it landed on a culture that already trusted the person in the cockpit to decide for himself. Machines can be bought by anyone with the money. That last part cannot. That is the reason the sky has stayed so quiet for so long over American wings. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe to the channel and watch our latest video.